Good morning. I'm Leslie Maitland, chair of the Amram Scholar Series. And with Rabbi Lustig away in Israel this week, it is my privilege to introduce you to today's speaker, Sarah Wildman. Her gripping family story is the subject of her new book, Paper Love, Searching for the Girl My Grandfather Left Behind, which recounts her journey across years and continents to bring to light and understand the painful legacy of the Holocaust within her family. Beginning with her discovery of a mysterious box of old letters from a girl described as her late grandfather's true love, Ms. Wildman would set out to investigate what had happened to the unknown Valley Sheftel when her grandfather escaped from Nazi-occupied Vienna in 1938, leaving her behind. The idealized family legend that her grandfather Karl had made it safely to America with everyone, namely his mother and his sister, was not the full truth Miss Wildman learned through Valley's letters. Rather, on yellowed paper, Miss Wildman confronted an outpouring of romantic passion and desperate fear from a long-lost girl whose many letters to Karl implored him from afar to save her from the Nazi menace. Had the charismatic Karl, as a struggling young doctor in Massachusetts, done all he could to help her? Miss Wildman needed to find out. Had Valley made it out alive? These haunting questions impelled an indefatigable search for answers. Yet beyond the specifics of this particular dramatic quest to learn the fate of 1 in 6 million, Ms. Wildman brings us with her into the broader past to experience the terrible moral ambiguities of the Nazi years and their aftermath. Through her impeccable reporting and thoughtful reflections, we find fresh understanding of what it means to live a daily battle for survival and what it costs for even those who win it. Ms. Wildman is a former New Republic staffer and has reported across Europe and the Middle East for numerous publications, including the New York Times, Slate, and the New Yorker. The 2014 Baruch Nonfiction Writing Fellow at the Wesleyan Writers Conference, she won the German Marshall Fund's 2010 Peter R. Weitz Prize for Excellence and Originality in European Coverage. In March of 2013, she received a Pulitzer Center for Crisis Reporting grant to report on the future of Jerusalem. She wrote Paper Love while a visiting scholar at the International Reporting Project at Johns Hopkins School for Advanced International Studies. We'd like to thank the Jewish Book Council for helping to arrange her talk today. And if everyone will kindly again silence cell phones, I'll turn you over to Sarah Wildman. Thank you for coming.
Should I stand? Should I come up here? Okay. Thanks. Can everyone hear me? The mics are okay? So, I don't know if we want to address this, but first, thank you to Leslie. Louder, okay. Thank you to Leslie and the Jewish Book Council and to Washington Hebrew. It's exciting to be here. I don't live very far away, so it's nice to be within my own community. I live over in Tacoma Park. And I thought I would just sort of explain a little bit about the background to the book, and I'll give you a little bit of a deep dive into the creation of the book. Because I'm a journalist, as Leslie mentioned, but I'm also the third generation. Yeah.
Can everyone hear Sarah okay?
You can't hear?
No.
Louder? Do you want me to use the hand, this?
Maybe this one is better? Could everybody hear me with this one?
Okay.
Okay.
Sorry, sure. Better that? Better here? Yeah. Okay. Sorry about that. Thank you. Thank you, Leslie and Washington Hebrew. I am honored. Too loud. Okay. Better here? Sorry about that. We'll take that again. I'm going to learn from Beyonce. I thought I'd give you a little bit of a background to the creation of the book as well as the story itself, because I'm a journalist, and so this is a work of journalism, but I'm also the third generation after the Holocaust, so it's a memoir of sorts. And I'm also a long, frustrated academic. I'm not an academic, but I had always sort of wanted to be an academic. So in some respects, this is the PhD I never did. So it's a deep dive into intellectual resources accomplished through journalistic techniques with, I would like to think, the passion and maybe obsession of someone for whom this was extremely personal. And the story begins, as Leslie mentioned, because there was a long-held myth in my family about my grandfather. He was perfect. He was a doctor. He had come at the perfect time in the fall of 1938, and he had escaped with everyone, his mother and his sister. And for a long time, as a child, everyone was my nuclear family. And so I didn't really question that story. It was remarkable. He'd gotten 2 people out at the exact moment they needed to go, including actually my great-aunt's husband and son, so really more than 2. And I didn't think about this. I didn't push past that story. I didn't think about how we really live lives, how the idea of a nuclear family is a child's view of everyone and what that means. And nor did I think about why they might have told the story they told and why they might have told it that way. Because we'd always been told the same thing. Anschluss, when Hitler invaded Vienna, was terrible, but my grandfather had gotten on lines immediately, and within 6 months, they were on a ship out, and he arrived in America at the exact right time, and here he was, started to practice, and life began. But some years after he died, my grandmother was still living, and I was in his old home office. And let me set the scene for you a little bit. My grandfather remained obsessed with German literature and music and the culture of Vienna for the entirety of his life. So that library was filled with 1,000 texts, both in translation and Goethe, Schiller, everything that sort of had made up that Viennese world. And there were busts of his idols, Goethe, Schiller, Theodor Herzl, and there was an Apollo. And beneath those busts, in an old cabinet, which I had somehow never opened, I found an album. And in that album was sort of those pictures that you see of the 30s of gorgeous 20 and 30-something young Jews on the cusp of the apocalypse who don't yet know what's coming. And you see those images and you always wonder, who are they? What happened? And there were dozens and dozens of pictures of my grandfather in his 20s, looking robust and surrounded by women. And in the very back was this folded note, which keeps going on and off your screen here. Oops. If it comes back. Here. Oh, sorry. Here it is. And in the back of this album was this folded note, which you can't really read from where you're sitting, but these little selfies, if you will, were of a girl who called herself Vali on the back. And each of the little captions say things like, "Will Carl write to me today? Oh, no letter. Maybe tomorrow." And the letter was dated May of 1939, and it was postmarked Troppau, Czechoslovakia. And I showed it to my grandmother, and she said dryly, "Oh, that was your grandfather's true love." She didn't say anything further. So I contacted my great aunt who had escaped with him, who was still living, and she said her name was Valerie Scheftel, and she'd come alone from Czechoslovakia to study at the University of Vienna Medical School, which was considered globally at the time the best medical school in the world, which is what we'd always been told. She'd come alone and she'd fallen in love with my grandfather immediately, and at first he'd ignored her. And then one summer he realized he was in love with her too, and he ran to tell her, and they had a whirlwind romance, and they planned to escape together. But then, instead,
he escaped with the people I knew he'd escaped with, his mother, his sister, his nephew. And she wrote me a letter. She typed it and sent it to my office at the time. And she said, "Find out what happened to her. She was absolutely brilliant. And I've always wondered." But at the time I thought, what can I do with this? I have this note. I had dozens of images of this girl, and she was lovely and gorgeous, and I had a name, but there's so many names. There are so many lists. And in a way, it's part of what happened was anonymity, that the dignity of individuality in the midst of our need, and it was very important for us to do this, and in the midst of our need to tell the story of the enormity of the horror, the victims themselves are lost. You know, a year ago, not quite a year ago, I participated in a Yom HaShoah commemoration, thank you, at a synagogue in Riverdale, New York, and it was beautiful. It was a beautiful ceremony, and there was a reading of names connected in some way to the congregation at the beginning. And I sat there thinking, who are they? When you hear a woman's name, she could be a grandmother, she could be a child. We don't know. There's no biographical detail. And inevitably, there's an anonymity in being on a list of names. There's a flattening to being a part of a list of names. And yet, even having a photograph and a small story of a girl who had come and become a woman studying medicine and was brilliant, what more could I tell you about her? But I became obsessed in my work with the idea of what happened to individuals. Who were regular people? People we don't read about, because maybe they didn't own a Renoir, so we're not arguing over them in court. Maybe they hadn't run the community, so they didn't leave public record. What happened to the Sarah Wildmans? What happened to people who like to think we're remarkable or unremarkable in our own way, but that we have an impact on our community, at least on our family, or that we exist? And I started thinking more and more and more about this because I started to report on the edges of what we thought about the war. So, you know, of course, the first waves of historiography, you know, Raoul Hilberg, the great names of history, told the story of the horror, the camps, the deportations. But slowly we've come to think about these individuals. And about a decade ago, or a little bit more, I learned about 3 slave labor camps in the heart of Paris, right around the time I was really thinking about individuals. And I went to report this story, and it sparked even more in me this idea that we needed to know more. These 3 slave labor camps in the heart of Paris, one near the Austerlitz train station, one near the Champs-Élysées, and one in the 10th arrondissement, right in the center of the city. They were tasked with sorting and redistributing all of the goods of the Jews of Paris. 76,000 Jews were deported from France, and they all had things. They had the things that make up a life. They had armoires, they had china, they had cribs, they had plates, they had cutlery. And what had happened to it? The French moving companies had been tasked with rushing each of these apartments, stripping them immediately so they'd be ready to be re-rented. And they would go to these depots, and they were chosen carefully because they had entrance points for the vans. And the Jewish slaves who manned these points, these slaves, would rush the trucks and pull everything off, and they were told to repackage everything usable and send it into the Reich. Those armoires, those cribs, that china, that cutlery, the pans, some of which still had food on it because people had been taken so quickly. But everything personal, all of their school papers and their photographs, all of their notes, everything that identified them as individuals, the slaves were told to burn, to erase them. Because the Nazi experiment was not just extinction or trying for extinction or trying for genocide. It was erasure. It was about erasing individuals. It was not simply blotting them out. It was taking them off the planet as though they hadn't existed. And so the people in these camps, and I interviewed some of them, they had never spoken. They had never spoken because first they felt this sense of what the French called pudeur, like a shame, a modesty, but tinged with shame, both because they had been the first to know that people weren't expected back, and because they'd seen the things of people they knew, and because somehow they still felt they had not experienced the worst. By being in these camps, they had not gone to Auschwitz, and so they hadn't experienced the worst, and so their story, they hadn't told it, because when the survivors of the other camps came back, they said, those are the stories that need to be told. But by the early part of the 2000s, they realized maybe their story needed to be told as well, so that we understood that the Holocaust happens in moments. It's not simply Auschwitz. Of course we must know Auschwitz. Of course we must study Auschwitz. But to understand the enormity of the terror and the enormity of what happened, all of these things need to be looked at in their time. But hearing them, again, I thought about Vali. What had been her story? And around this time, I was in a meeting at the Holocaust Museum here in Washington, and they said to me, you know, you did this story about this, what are we talking about at the margins, and what are the questions we've not yet asked, and what are the things we don't know to ask? And we're interested, this is the museum, in an archive in the far west of Germany called the International Tracing Service. And the International Tracing Service was a repository for everything the Allies had collected as they moved through town after town and camp after camp and sort of sucked up paper along the way. And they stuck it all in this town, about an hour west of Kassel, if you can picture it, quite deep in rural far west Germany. But the International Red Cross had taken it over by the end of the 40s, and then it had been closed to researchers. Its task was to reunite families. At the end of the war, there was such total chaos that they needed this place which could match family to family member, survivor to victim. And they said historians, genealogists, other people who sort of started to apply to be able to come would muck up the works. But by the middle of the 2000s, it seemed time had come. And the museum wanted somebody to write a story that would convince the State Department to open it up. Would that I was so powerful. I was not. But I became interested as well. Again, I started thinking, what if there was something in those boxes for me, to paraphrase Dorothy? And partly that became, because right around that time I was visiting my parents, and I was home, it was around Pesach, and I don't know if you've had this experience, but I was rooting around in their basement, it was midnight, let's say, I was sort of awake and at loose ends, and I came across a box they had taken from my grandparents' house, and it was labeled C.J. Wildman Personal. And in it were sort of things I recognized from my grandparents' house, an old music box, his army hat. He had joined the U.S. Army eventually. But there was a box within that box, so this was a large box, and then a smaller file box from the 40s was in there. And it was labeled Patient Correspondence, A through G. And I don't know, I just idly opened it. And it was hundreds and hundreds of letters held together with these rubber bands that disintegrated as I touched them. And they weren't from patients at all. They were from his entire exploded Viennese world. It was from all those people I had not thought about when I had embraced the idea that he had left with everyone. And of course, no refugee leaves with everyone. Not now and not then. But in that box were dozens and dozens of letters from Vali, from the girl from the photographs. And I thought, maybe with these letters, I can finally do what my great aunt had asked me to do so long ago. Maybe I could use her letters in some way as a guide. And if I could get into these archives, I could start by retracing her steps, both geographically, but also through the documents kept on her by the Nazi state. And so I went with the first group of scholars in the summer of 2008 to Bad Arolsen, where the group from the Holocaust Museum had organized. And let me set the scene. The town of Bad Arolsen is something out of the Brothers Grimm. It's a perfect fairy tale town with a Baroque city center and a Schloss, a palace at the end, with a prince named Wittekind of Waldeck, whose own godfather was Heinrich Himmler. All around this beautiful little city center, which is with their flowers in the windows, and you can picture it. There's a sort of New England-looking campus, almost like a school campus of buildings, which had been SS barracks. And all those barracks were filled with miles and miles and miles of material on 17.5 million victims. Not just Jews, everyone the Nazis had touched. Entire buildings devoted to camps, entire buildings devoted to the displaced persons camps. Just outside even that ring of this New England little town, there was another building, a former NATO driving school. And in that driving school, which was sort of looked like a 1960s era elementary school, there were those metal shelves people often put in their basements, and there were stacks and stacks and stacks of paper open to the elements. And every piece of paper was a request for information. Do you know something about my son? Have you heard anything about my mother, my uncle, my town? Did anyone survive my town but me? Can you tell me anything? My son must still be alive. Someone saw him on the road from Ulm. It was the spring of 1945. It's not possible that he's dead. Please tell me he's alive. Written in 4 languages to every single member of every single possible person this mother could possibly think of. And the case is stamped unsolved. Miles of desperation on metal shelves that look like they could be in your basement. And they're called tracing and documentation files. And in those files, I found one of the first clues that ended up being a clue I'll come back to at the end. But someone else had come looking for Vali in the 50s. And she wasn't my grandfather. It wasn't someone connected to my family at all. Because it turned out that Vali had married someone in the winter of, let's say, 42, 43. I wasn't sure then, which I found romantically devastating, even though, of course, my grandfather had married my grandmother, else I wouldn't be here. And I loved my grandmother, but still, I was on something of a romantic quest. And still, I realized that being in that space, to have a file, meant someone had to remember you. And in and of itself, memory is a privilege. What if an entire town had been wiped out? Who would remember you? So here I was on this quest for this woman, and at least I knew someone else had actually had this idea. In the 50s and 60s, she had searched and searched. She had sent letter after letter after letter. But at first, I had no idea how to find that person. I thought, well, I'll set that aside. And so what I did instead was I went back to the letters themselves, and I started again. Vali starts out in a town called Troppau, which is now called Opava. It's at the border of where the now Czech Republic becomes Poland. And it had been a Silesian capital of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, so it has a beautiful opera house. It had a beautiful city center. It was sort of rural cosmopolitan at the time. And she returns there because her mother is there. Her mother had raised her alone. Her mother had divorced about when Vali was about a year old and raised her alone. And she starts there, and that's when she writes that note to my grandfather. But Troppau and towns like it, which were given to Germany under the Munich Agreement, became virulently, aggressively, atrociously anti-Semitic after the Munich Agreement. They wanted so badly to prove themselves to be faithful to the Reich that they became more anti-Semitic than even to live in Berlin. Because at first I thought, why did she go back to Czechoslovakia? Why doesn't she go with my grandfather? And you realize she doesn't know what I know. And again, I have to keep reminding myself, she doesn't have later knowledge. To go to Czechoslovakia in March of 1938 was free. It made sense. Her mother was there. She didn't want to abandon her mother, but also it was free. She surely thought she had time to regroup. She couldn't have known that 6 months later, her slice of Czechoslovakia was the Sudetenland and was about to be handed to Hitler. So when it becomes aggressive and horribly anti-Semitic, and in the files of the Opava archives, I find her mother has signed away everything. As a Jewess, I am no longer entitled to the business I have built up over the last 26 years. As a Jewess, I hand over everything, my bank accounts, my business, everything I've ever owned. And while she's tidying up her business accounts, which is how Vali sort of very euphemistically puts it in her letters, Vali sets out for Berlin, which again, to me, seemed ridiculous and counterintuitive. But again, she's not explaining things to my grandfather. She writes almost in a code. And you have to read against it to the restrictions that they're under, because every single one of her letters are opened. So she'll say things like, do you know there aren't any young people anymore? Or do you know there aren't any men left? There's only women here. Because men were being sent out after Kristallnacht because the idea was men would be more likely to be attacked. But she doesn't say that. And she doesn't say, my mother's business has been Aryanized and taken over. She says, my mother is back in Troppau tidying up her business. But she still is talking mostly about love. And the thing about Vali from the very beginning is this. She feels like us. She cares more. And the one thing she drives home again and again and again about the fact that she has studied for a decade to be a doctor, and no one is letting her be a doctor now. She just wants to be a doctor. She wants to be seen as a professional. She's not sure about kids. She's not even sure about marriage. But she misses her boyfriend. In 1939, she writes to him, I think of you when I pass newsstands and I see entertainment journals, or when I'd wear a dress that you'd like, or when people speak of love, or when the word America is uttered. And at first she says she has a chance to go to the UK, and she's not terribly upset that it has passed. But what neither one of them know is that Hitler is about to invade Poland. In the spring of 1939, in September of 1939, when he invades Poland, those options are closed to her. But again and again she says, I'm still mostly thinking of you. They say that my quota number is far off, but I'm still mostly thinking of you. As 39 becomes 40, she moves to Berlin because, again, it seems counterintuitive, but she moves to Berlin because she's anonymous there. She's not yet wearing a star. And again, you think back, what do you think about the Holocaust? Do you think Kristallnacht? Maybe you think Anschluss, Kristallnacht, a yellow star, Auschwitz. But you realize years take place in between these things. Kristallnacht is the fall of 38. The star does not go on until the fall of 41. This is what it was like to live in between these moments. As the restrictions pile up, as 39 becomes 40, Jews are no longer allowed to buy clothes or shoes. And then they're not allowed to resole their shoes. And she writes to him in the spring of 40, she says, my beloved only one, my boy, you will be with me in this world. This one sentence in your last letter stays with me all the time, wherever I am. I can hear it, see it, and feel it always. But when? I don't know the answer. And the consulate has only a vague idea of 1 to 2 years, meaning an eternity, unimaginable, inconceivable, equal to 100 years to me, who must be with you within the shortest imaginable period of time, right now, immediately. Now the third summer without you begins. She doesn't tell him that part of what is unimaginable is that the Jews of the town of Stettin, which is a Baltic seaport, have been brutally rounded up in a foreshadowing of what's to come. But my grandfather knows it, and he knows she knows it because a rabbi named Alfred Yosby, who came to the United States that spring and became a father of modern Hillel, writes to him and he says, I know these women, Vali and her mother, because I was working as a rabbi in the exterior parts of the Reich. And with the roundup of the Jews of Stettin, I no longer feel that life is uncomfortable, but life is in mortal danger. This is the spring of 1940. And he says to him, you can get these women illegal visas to Chile. They look excellent. We think they'll work. They're just $150 per person. And so I thought, okay, I know $150 in 1940 are not our $150, but still, it's not $1 million. What did you do? What did you do with this information? And so I went back to look for what was happening for my grandfather at that moment. Remember, I'd been told he arrived, he started his practice, life was perfect. It was easy. He arrived, he was able to practice immediately, everything worked. But in fact, in that same box of letters, there were a collection of cashed checks from something called the National Committee for the Resettlement of Foreign Physicians, in tiny amounts, $20, $44, $80. And the National Committee for the Resettlement of Foreign Physicians, it turns out, was a group fighting the American Medical Association, which was actively lobbying against licensing refugee physicians who were arriving in this country. So that by 1943, there were only 2 states left that would license a refugee foreign physician, for the most part Jews, not every single one, but for the most part Jews. And they kept files. At the Immigration Research Center in Minnesota, it turned out that this organization, which had a social worker arm, sort of progressive era style, Hull House style notes on some of their refugees, they had notes on my grandfather, 50 pages. He was something of a case study for them. By the spring of 1940, they note, his mother has sold the last of her jewelry, netting her $60. They can no longer feed themselves. He can't afford his $5 rent. He is destitute. He is struggling to find any purchase in this country at all, and he has asked them for tiny loans to start a practice in the far west of northwest Massachusetts. This organization had thought if they sent physicians outside of city centers to areas which needed doctors, that perhaps the xenophobia could be met by need for actual doctors. And for the most part, they were right. But he writes to them saying, it's very hard to start in a new place, and he hasn't yet been able to make it, but they give him 3 months of funding, 3 months to become successful before they will uproot him again and put him someplace else because they have a list of others who need those resources. And they also remind him that this is a loan, it's not a gift. And the moment within those 3 months, he actually is able to break even, he begins to pay them back. And the loans, as I said, were in amounts of $20, $44. 1 month, there is a loan that meets the amount needed by Vali and her mother for the illegal visas to Chile, which may or may not have worked. Every penny of it was accounted by him in rent, in food, in lodging. So there was no money for a potential visa to Chile, and the moment passes, and at this point she doesn't tell him, but she is living in a Judenhäuser. In Berlin, unlike in Warsaw, Jews weren't put into a ghetto altogether. They were put into ghetto-like apartments, which had once housed 2 people, but now housed 15. All sleeping together, cheek by jowl on the floor, all sharing one kitchen, one bathroom, trying to get to their forced labor assignments. And she doesn't tell them that the restrictions are mounting and are legion, that so day after day Jews are denied things like meat, legumes, coffee, tea, eggs, jam. That the newspaper is writing articles on how to make omelets without eggs, how to cook with nothing, and that the editor of the magazine ends up killing himself. She doesn't tell him this. In the spring of 41, though, after all of these things, these restrictions piling and piling and piling up, and the requests for affidavits and remaking his affidavits, she writes to him, "Dear, dear boy, today I have to write to you again. It's so sad that by now our correspondence has come down to an exchange of letters only on certain occasions. A long, long time ago you wrote to me from Vienna when I was supposed to go to Prague that one should not be so small-minded to sacrifice the present to the phantom of the future. You wrote these words in a completely different context at the time, but you were so right then, and maybe that's your thinking now as well. And maybe you are right in not wanting to sacrifice your present either to the past or to the future. It is, however, so terribly sad for me because I live almost without a present, and I can live only for the past and for the future." She says this, but she says, let's not dwell on it. My affidavit has come through. All I need now is passage on a ship. But the summer of 41, the U.S. State Department decided that anyone who was potentially leaving a relative behind would be denied their visa even if they'd already received it. The family rule meant families like the Frank family, for example, couldn't leave. Otto Frank wrote to Nathan Strauss, the heir to the Macy's department store fortune, that summer, saying, "You might remember that I've got girls." But he can't do anything for him either. She tells him in this same letter that the ships are sold out through September of 42, to fall of 42. February 42. September, she looks for something in September. She looks for something that fall. Everything is sold out. Perhaps he can get her something. But the shipping companies were told not to open extra seats because of this new rule about family members. There wasn't going to be a need to add extra seats on ships. And in fact, many of the seats wouldn't be used that had already been booked. So the summer passes. And that September is when she puts on the star. All this has happened in between Kristallnacht and the star. And still she writes him, maybe you can find a way for us to get to Cuba or to Sweden, anything, just try anything. And they continue to write to each other. And then the U.S. enters the war in December, and her letters are cut off. And for a long time I thought, I will still fail her. I can't do it. I can't tell her story. I don't know what happens after her letters end. And there's much more to it. Her letters go into all these things. She's working at the Jewish hospital. She's passing from place to place, very anonymous, but she's desperately trying at least to stay with her mother. She tries everything she can to be with her mother. Once the star goes on, life becomes much more difficult. The deportations begin that fall. But both of them are working for the Reichsvereinigung, the Jewish council, so to speak, of Berlin. And so they have work. And so they hope that it will mean she's still allowed to at least work in health and not go work in a factory. She worries about this to him in her letters, although she doesn't exactly explain what that means. But again, her letters end. And though I can read everything I can about what happens to the Jews of Berlin at that moment, I don't know how to look further. I don't know what else to say. And I want so much to be able to tell the story, her story. And then a colleague visited, and one of the things we haven't discussed is Vienna itself. Because Vienna itself had been such a mythical figure in my grandfather's past, and such a perfect place in my grandfather's past. And in fact, even this began to unravel as I looked into this book, because the fact was that Vienna itself had been a hotbed of anti-Semitism in the early 30s, well before the Nazis came in. That there were Nazi factions on campus, and that my grandfather's friends were regularly beaten and beaten bloody. And I thought, still, this isn't about my grandfather at all. It can't be him. But an academic there had handed me a text written by his best friend about how dangerous it was to be a man on campus in the early 30s if you were a Jew. And so I became interested in who were the descendants of the perpetrators and bystanders, my cohorts to some degree, the third generation after this trauma, not just of victims like myself, but of those who'd lived there. Because of them, there are many who've become scholars, whose own flip side to my constant debate as a kid, how would I have survived? Who would I have been? Where would I have gone? Would I have gotten out? Was, who would I have been? Would I have saved someone? Would I have stood by? Would I have participated? Who would I have been? In the same way that I had always wondered these things myself. And among these descendants, is his Holocaust historian in Austria, and he said to me, why didn't you look for the person who looked for her in Arelson? Remember, I had found this document which said she'd been searched for. And I said, well, she's not in Google. And he said, okay, come on, really, what have you done? And I had searched a bit, but I'd come up very empty, and I had put it down. And he said, I think you should go back to that. Go back. What can you lose? And so I started thinking about how people searched after the war without all of our digital crutches that we use now, which make us feel that we have everything in our own home, that we don't need to go to an archive or a library or talk to someone. And right after the war, in addition to people writing to the Red Cross at Arelson, people posted classified ads. They posted classified ads in old survivor newsletters, newspapers. In the U.S., we had the Aufbau, which means reconstruction. And in my grandparents' house, the Aufbau and the New England Journal of Medicine had equal weight on the dining room table. And in the UK, they had the Association of Jewish Refugees Journal. It served those who had come on kinder transports and all those who came during the war, and then the refugees who came after. And so I placed an ad there with everything I knew, both about the searcher, which was very little, and about the people I was looking for, Vali, and I extended it to the man she'd married. And then I kind of forgot about it. I sort of thought, okay, I don't know who reads classified ads anymore, so I'll let that be. And a couple months later, I went to London on a conference for something completely different, and I begged the conference to let me stay an extra night. You could be in a room in Cincinnati, you could be anywhere in the world at some of these conferences, and you fly in and you fly out. And I said, let me stay one day, it's London, I want to see London. And so they agreed. And I went to the Tate, and I met up with a Holocaust historian who had written that book about the camps of Paris. And he said to me that day over tea, write something about Vali, don't fail her. And I said, I can't. I don't know enough. I can't do it. And he said, you do. You have a lot. And then he finally said, you know what? You're not my student. Do what you want. You've spent a lot of time on this, though. I think you shouldn't walk away. And I came home in between the Tate and going out to dinner, and I checked my email at the hotel, rather. And there was an email from a woman saying, imagine my emotion, but I'm the youngest daughter of the searcher. I think I have some of the things you're looking for. I don't know if you're ever in London. Let me go to Leslie, and then we can open it for questions after.
She's leaving it in no high suspense, which I very much identify with, and I have to say that that was terrific, and I feel very much that Sarah is a truly a kindred spirit, I must say, for me, especially. I had embarked on a similar search to find the great lost love that my mother had left behind in Marseille in 1942. And so a lot of the experiences that Sarah recounts in her book are so personally meaningful to me. And I urge you all to read it because, as you can see, her enthusiasm and her passion, but also her journalistic integrity, the academic rigor that she brought to the entire search. coupled with her insightful observations and feelings, make it a really special and beautiful book. And it was, I think, a fabulous talk, and there'll be an opportunity for questions. And I thank you so very, very much. It was really, really beautiful. As is our custom in Amram, to interrupt at this high point to give you a little taste of what's coming up, I just have to say that on March 13th, Sunday, at 10:30 a.m., we have Bruce Hoffman, who is a scholar of terrorism. He heads the Georgetown University Center on Terrorism, and he will be speaking on Anonymous Soldiers, the Struggle for Israel in 1917 to 1947, examining whether terrorism is ever a useful tactic to achieve a political aim. So it's certainly a very timely topic. And after that, on March 29th at 7 p.m., a Tuesday night, for a change, we have Roberta Kaplan, who is an attorney who argued successfully in the Supreme Court to win same-sex marriage rights. That's on March 29th, and then we have further programs after that, so pick up a leaflet out there. And then Rabbi Sklut has asked me to make one announcement today, which is that on Sunday, February 28th at 6 p.m. here at Temple, there will be a dramatic reading of a play called The Promised Land, chronicling the experience of Sudanese refugees who crossed the desert to enter Israel legally and illegally, only to find themselves stranded in the drama of relocation and displacement. At this time when war and disaster has forced over 60 million people from their homes across the world, the largest refugee crisis since World War II, Israel faces its own crisis with refugees, and he asks you to please join us for this performance. Now we're going to go back to Sarah for questions, and we're going to offer you the opportunity to either put your questions on cards or to raise your hand and just shout them out. We ask you not to make speeches, but to ask questions, and Sarah will be happy to answer them. So I'll start off with one to get you going, which is, Sarah describes going back on a fellowship to Vienna to do her research, of course, the city where Vali and her grandfather Karl had studied and had fallen in love. She goes and sits in cafes and drinks what they might have drunk and walks the streets where they met and fell in love. And she experienced very much what I experienced in my research, a feeling of almost falling through a chink in time. That she is, in one sense, at home in Vienna. It's a place where she might have been born, she might have lived, had her grandfather remained in Vienna, perhaps, in some alternate universe, and so it feels at home. And at the same time, she's an outsider, a Jew returned, a stranger who does not really belong there. Who is she? Where is she? What time is this? What place is this? That is such a remarkable experience that I hope you could elaborate a bit on that. And then please ask your questions. Fire away. Thank you.
Sorry about the PowerPoint. So that was very beautifully explained. I've always had this strong sense of being an accidental American. And I think all of us are, to some degree. Perhaps not Native Americans, but beyond that, I think for the most part, we are a nation of immigrants. And so it's an experience that many people have, but for me, it was something that really shaped my identity. Why did I speak English? Why was I American and not, let's say, Israeli? Why was I not French? Why was I not Austrian? And because Vienna had been such an important piece of my grandfather's identity, it felt important to me to start there, to really understand it. Although when I first got there, I realized I only had the stuff of fantasy. And in a strange way, a city like Vienna, which is so old, you can have that sense of what it means to have been there, to walk in those spaces, to go to their opera, to be in their parks. And at the same time, it's not my language. It's not my city. And when you told people, and often people asked, have you ever been to this city before? And I had said, well, I had come as a teenager with my family to see where my grandfather was from. It's an immediate indicator of who you are. And for the most part, that was well received. Sometimes less well received, but for the most part, that was well received. But for me, it became this strange thing where I fell in love with the city too, even despite its kind of melancholy ghostliness for me. You know, where did I fit in there? Was I a part of it? I actually received a beautiful email from a colleague from this institute where I had had this fellowship, and she said, "Isn't it an amazing thing, us, the grandchildren of this generation, to now have found friendship?" And for me, that became really important, to know Austrians, to know the city and its people, and not just think of it as this one-dimensional, or at least, you know, sort of romantic historical piece, but to know the people who live there now and have deep conversations with them about what it meant to carry this legacy and how we'll share it going forward. You know, I think one of the things I often will talk about, and Leslie didn't mention just now, though it wasn't in the Vienna part of the book, but I did do this book through 2 pregnancies. So I was very conscious of the next generation after mine that won't know this generation, that won't have this even tenuous tether. I often say I was growing little Jews in pursuit of lost Jews. But there was a piece of it for me about how palpable and important the geographies themselves were, and how cities are like archaeological digs. You can sort of see what you want to see there. And that the cities themselves have gone on and had layer after layer of other experiences. And so much of the time, people don't exactly know what has taken place on a specific street or in a specific house. Now there's this memorialization that's taken place first across Germany and now in Austria and parts of Hungary called Stolperstein, where you can walk out of a shop or a house and see a little brass cobblestone, and it will say on it, "Here lived this person, died or murdered, Auschwitz or Theresian," or name a camp. And it's very, for me, it's quite profound. Although, in a way, the hardest piece, and I don't want to take away from your reading of the book, but for a long time in Vienna, I still had this very magical, almost romantic sense of the city. But actually, on one of my very much later reporting trips after that fellowship, I went back and I was advised to meet with an academic who was working on a cemetery memorial project. And I almost didn't meet with her. I was really busy. And the people I was working on had not died in Vienna, and so I didn't know if I needed to go and look at a cemetery. But for the most part, when you do these things, you think it's better to go. Maybe you'll find something out. And so at the edge of the city is something called the Gürtel. And the funny part for me about this experience was, while I was a fellow, we went to bars on the Gürtel all the time. They've built these beautiful bars. The Gürtel is the above-ground part of the U-Bahn. It was built by Otto Wagner, a famous architect at the turn of the last century. And it had become very run down. And so in the 90s, they got all this money to turn it into these beautiful restaurants and bars. So I was there all the time. But just beyond the Gürtel, at Nussdorfer Strasse, there's an old Jewish cemetery, not the main one, which people mostly visit if they come to Vienna to see this cemetery. And she said, "Meet me there." Well, I hadn't even known it existed. And I got there, and it was closed to the public, but the door was slightly ajar. And I walked in, and it was destroyed as it had been destroyed by the Nazis in 1938, where they had opened graves, and there were pieces of bone still on the ground, where they had opened graves to use them as racial examples at the Natural History Museum. And I started crying. And I started taping as I walked in, thinking she was already going to be there, and she wasn't there yet. So you can hear, when I went back to transcribe it, I can hear myself crying in this tape, and I'm almost embarrassed that here's this woman working in this incredibly difficult space, and why am I crying? And we started talking about her experience, and I said, why do you work on this? What is this? And she said, in some ways, one of the hardest parts is that this is what it was. And so in a strange way, you almost want to preserve the horror of what you're seeing here, and yet you can't let people in it. And I realized that even for me, I had romanticized so much of what that experience of Vienna had been like, even up until the Anschluss, which my grandfather experienced. And he lived in Vienna for another 6 months. But this is what the Anschluss was. This destruction, this horror, this dishonoring, this disinterment. And she told me this story because she had also had this strange memory within her own family. She had for a long time felt the war had something to do with her, she said, but she couldn't figure out why she thought that. She was not Jewish, or she thought she wasn't Jewish. And when she began studying the war more earnestly, in high school, she said, I know this has something to do with me. I don't know why. And she went to talk to her mother, and her mother said, talk to your grandmother. And it turned out that her grandmother was Jewish, and her mother was Jewish. And that her grandmother had hidden her mother as a 1-year-old with a Christian family and had fled herself to Shanghai. She had assumed the passage to Shanghai could be too hard for an infant or a 1-year-old. And she thought she was doing the best for her daughter, but she came back to get her when the girl was 6 years old. That's how much time had passed before she was able to return. And neither woman had ever really forgiven the other, even though both lives had been saved and this trauma had been retained. And then they had decided that the way to deal with it was to never speak of it. And so this woman, though, had become a Holocaust historian and felt that, in fact, it was her story.
Forgive us, we apparently have to share a mic, but we have a written question and encourage everyone. There's Maria going around with cards for people who might want to write, or else just raise your hand if you have want to pose it yourself. But now, I don't know how far we can lure Sarah into answering this one, but it says, what did you learn from the message that you got in London? Who was it who had contacted you? And can you tell us anything more about what happened to Vali? So we'll see how far we get with that. And I have another one.
I'm not going to go too far down that road, only because the book itself, to some degree, is a journey, and it's not. And I'd like you to take it. And part of it is so much. I mean, and I'm not. You can take it out of the library. I'm not saying you must go buy the book, but part of it is my own incremental knowledge that builds as much as what I knew that they knew it as it happens. And I really tried to make that case for that, to really understand choices made with the knowledge we have at hand. But I will say the email was sent by a woman named Carol, who is, I still think of it as a minor miracle that this happened. And she was the daughter of the woman who had come searching. Vali had married a man named Hans Fabisch. He was 21. She was 31 by then. And Hans was a totally one-dimensional figure to me when I first found his name. There was no way for me to have any idea what had happened to him, who he was, and I had not really investigated it fully. But Carol was his niece. And so for Carol, Hans was the hero of the story. And one of the great joys of this book was actually realizing both that as much as I had wanted desperately to restore the dignity of individuality to a single person, we don't live as single individuals bouncing around like atoms in the universe, that we live in communities. And that, in fact, one of those small comforts is the fact that she meets this man who becomes her community and that he does everything for her. Because what Carol hands me is a letter from, a letter which I won't describe because it's so cinematic, I'd rather you read it. But also she tells me she has a family archive of material being sent out at the same time as mine. And what it allows me to do is to tell the story from yet another perspective. And honestly, it also allows me to tell the story of this man named Hans, who had been this shadow in this family, this man lost to this family. And both of us discovered his letters, basically, by finally looking at them and discovering the heroism of this young man who did everything for a woman he'd just met. Oh, okay. Sorry, right here.
Thank you so much. One of the things I've come to realize over the last several years is that with the availability of the internet and our ability to go places we never could go before, more of these individual stories are being brought to all sorts of aspects of history. Going back farther than this, which brings to life so many things that we never had the ability to understand before. And I think, and I'm wondering your take on it as a writer and a journalist, how this will change the way that history is taught and history is viewed going forward.
Thank you.
I think that's a great question. One of the things I very much wanted with this book was to recognize it both as a Holocaust story and a Jewish story, but also as a story of that has resonance in other ways. And in fact, I did Kojo Namdi's show, and I talked about that with him before. And so we sort of went down that road, and people who called in, someone called in whose family had come from Cambodia in the 70s. And someone called in whose family had been a part of the Great Migration of African Americans coming from south to north. And I was really happy that we went in this direction because I felt like this conversation about stories told, about family myth and memory, but also about how individual stories allow a tactile relationship to history that is often very difficult. That this is the moment with the Holocaust in particular where we're tipping from memory into history. And so it's these stories that allow us to relate ourselves into the story. And to some degree, I think that, especially in our very, very, very heavily tech-saturated world where we're very distracted all the time, I do think that it's helpful to see ourselves in these stories and not find it as just distance. This has happened to someone else. This happened 100 years ago. This happened 200 years ago. I think to some degree it's why, my family right now, we're obsessed with the musical Hamilton. We can all sing it for you. We can do that another time. Including my 7-year-old who won't allow you to sing it with her. She needs to sing. She's really into it. But it's really interesting thinking about teaching history through this. I think that there's something about, there's the line, another immigrant coming up from the bottom. He talks about Hamilton's roots, and there's something incredibly moving about relating to Hamilton as a human. That everyone from my 7-year-old to me to beyond has gravitated towards this. I think it is a reconsidering of how we tell history as in a personal way. It's kind of joyful in that context. It's joyful in a way to see, a first grader asking all kinds of questions about the American Revolution. So it's really interesting. I do think that it has resonance in other parts of history telling.
I was going to ask one other question here. When you went back to Vienna and you entered history, did you find yourself feeling angry? As you identified with Valley and your grandfather, did you, and you met people and you wondered what they had done during that period, how they had responded, did you find yourself becoming angry in their stead? Were you able to separate out and say these are people of a different generation? They did not experience this. They were not there. What was your reaction to the people you met?
Do you mean the people I'm meeting along the way who are descendants of victims and perpetrators, or you mean of bystanders and bystanders?
Or observers, the average person in Vienna. For example, when I went back to Germany, she found herself really furious. This was the life I should have lived. This was my town. This was my house. This was my school. These were my friends. And I was wrong. She was really good.
This is a hard question. I don't know if I found myself angry as much as I found myself very much wanting to have people see how arbitrary it was that I wasn't their neighbor. And that to me felt really important, and somehow to have it recognized that we should have been. I think when I was younger, when I was first in Vienna, I had that feeling a bit more as a teenager. At this point, meeting people who I knew it wasn't their story, I also, my keen desire was it for not to be dismissed as we've heard this story before. You know, you do hear a lot that people, just like here, you know, I mean, that people have heard a lot of these stories. You know, do they need another story? And my argument was that they do. You know, that each of these stories deserve being told. I feel like this needs a longer answer. I want to think on it for a minute and open it further. But I would say for the most part, the majority of people I interacted with were so open to the idea of telling the story, and were sort of thrilled to be a part of it in a way. I mean, not everybody, which we can get into, but let me go to the back.
Want the mic, or you can shout out? Well, I
can talk about it.
Okay, sorry.
So first of all, thank you for sharing Belle's story. I read the book, and I found it so incredibly moving and sensitive and just beautifully told. So I had a knot in my throat reading the book, and it came back during today. It's really wonderfully done. I recommend it to all. My question has to do with the race against time that you felt you were against as you were doing this book. Maybe if you had started 5 years earlier, how would the book have been different? If you had started 5 years later, could you have written the book at all? Could you elaborate a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Did everyone hear it? Okay. Okay, the question was, could this book, did I feel a race against time writing the book? And the sense of if the book had been different if it had been written 5 years earlier, and could it have been written 5 years later? And this is a great question for me because the book began, I thought, where I would not find any eyewitnesses. And yet, from the very beginning, I was obsessed with the idea of eyewitnesses. And so I have often, and to this day, things will come up which I rue not having done this 10 years ago, let's say more than 5 years ago, 10 years ago, or longer. You know, this would have been a very, very different book. I mean, I was too young, but if it had been done, let's say, in the early 90s, you know, when I was in high school. So, you know, it wouldn't have been where I was. But what would often happen for me was when I searched for certain things, I would come across testimony from survivors of specific things I was looking for, given, let's say, 1993 or 4. Often I found that I had just missed people. It happened again and again. And even in the parts about the book about Vienna, I spent a lot of time looking for old alumni. And a man named Herbert Posch, who, if you know from the book, he's the first to honor the Jews expelled from the University of Vienna Medical School, and he does it in 1999, and it's quite late. Vienna is very late to honor the Jews. And he gives me a list of people, and people die after I meet them. I mean, it's just really like there's a man who ends up. I interviewed him, and I think he died just a few months later. And also, for example, my grandfather's closest friend, when I went to interview him, his wife was still totally together and wonderful. He had Alzheimer's, and he'd had it for many years. There was a great sense of loss I felt, and I also felt that I couldn't rely only upon eyewitnesses as a result. And yet, my book is this sort of tipping point. I think that what the French call these types of papers and things lieux de mémoire, these places of memory. And at first I thought that the book would be only about these places of memory and trying to construct this sort of history without witnesses. And yet, of course, the book, as you know, and I won't ruin it for people, but it does hint, I mean, sort of the cinematic hinge of the book is discovering this eyewitness. And I think, could it be written 5 years from now? Yes, but it would be a different book. It would be a different book. And I think that melancholy of knowing you're at that point was a driver in some way. And at the same time, I constantly berated myself for not having begun sooner.
Thank you. Well, I'm on 2:17, so I tried to finish it before today, so I'm hoping you won't give away the end. But a couple of questions. One that touched me was when I think you were around 6 months pregnant, and you went back to Opava, that I guess is in the Silesian part of the former Yugoslavia, and there were people that were not Jewish, but were taking on the role of being guides, and you had hooked up with this gentleman and eventually met his mother. And it seemed like they were on a course that this is what they wanted to tell. This was their story. They were not empathic to your needs, because I think you got into a couple of arguments with this guy in terms of you wanted to go in another direction, and the fact that, he kept saying, well, let's go up this hill, let's go up to that, not taking into any consideration that, you were tired, and perhaps for you to get a breath. And I just felt that whole experience, the people there were just riveted to their own story of what happened and not being aware of what other people's needs were.
So there's,
okay.
Without getting too much, and then I won't go too far down this road, but so it's a little, so one of the things that happened a lot was that you realize it is not only my history. And I think one of the interesting questions around interacting with descendants of bystanders and perpetrators is they are also trying to tell the history, or they have decided how to tell it in a certain way, and it has different motivating forces for them. For them, sometimes it's quite altruistic, but often they didn't know any Jews at all. And so you realize you're coming at it from these very different emotional points, and that became really poignant. I'm going to pivot from what you mentioned, and it's true that people did have other desires to show me different things, but sometimes what happened was you inadvertently stumbled into a moment you wouldn't have known you'd find. And this gets into this question of, that Leslie mentioned it, we both come at this as journalists, and you're sort of always looking for the other stories happening simultaneously. And on that Czech trip, for me, what I think back on most, was I went to a group of formerly hidden children. And there was a woman there, the only woman there who spoke English. In fact, I sat in on this meeting and kind of, on my part, ridiculously had not thought about the fact it would be in Czech, which is not a language I speak. And afterwards, there was a single woman there who spoke English, and of course she had not heard of Vali. It was sort of very grand of me to think she might have heard of her. But she said she was interested in the archives I'd been to, and I said, why? And she said, because I don't know if I am I. And I said, I don't understand. And she said she was born in 1943 and hidden as an infant. And then everyone was murdered. Everyone. Her parents, her sister, her aunts and uncles, grandparents. And after the war, of this enormous family, the only two people left were one uncle and one grandmother. And a farmer said to this uncle, didn't your brother have two girls? I think the baby was hidden with this farmer. And they go and they talk to the farmer, who doesn't want to give the baby up, but eventually he does. But throughout her childhood in the 50s, the grandmother would say to her, if she was bad, well, we don't even know if you're you. So she was in search of her own identity. And I realized that so much of this is about these mosaics, about who we are and how we construct our sense of self. And my sense of self had been so formed by this idea of being part of this successful refugee story. And so much of the time, we as Americans think in these happier arcs. But survival was not necessarily happy. Survival could be very, very difficult. And so much of this became about understanding that this was not just about a survival story. This was about a woman whose very identity, how do we know who we are? How do you know you every day? You're told, because I'm a mother of small children, so every day, we love you, who loves you? I'm Ima in my house. Ima, Daddy loves you. Saba loves you. Whatever it is, you're formed by these nuclear, and then slightly beyond your nuclear units. Your identity is shaped by it. My 2.5-year-old will constantly say, "Saba in New Jersey." Yes, Saba in New Jersey. And you reiterate these things to yourself because it situates you in the world. Where am I? I am here. My father is here. My sister is here. Everything is good. And what if none of that exists? And for me, I really wanted to deeper understand what that meant, this complete discomforting, that this was what the war experience was, not just what had been filtered to me by my birth in the 70s. So the question was, what did my grandmother think?
And your parents.
And my parents. Okay. My grandmother is no longer living. And I'm not so sure I would have done it if she was still alive. I love my grandmother very much. I don't want to imply that I didn't. My father, it's his father, and my aunt, I think for them the biggest thing has been knowing that they didn't. My father says now, why didn't we ask more? Which is a typical thing that across the second generation of my family people have said from reading this. And it was hard to. I think there were very polished narratives that were put forward. And even when I interviewed my great aunt for the Holocaust Museum, I did an interview with her. This is well before the book. I kind of wanted to get her on tape with her lovely accent, telling her story, but I didn't push in against the bruise of the people she does mention when I go back and listen to it. I think for the most part, the one question people often ask me is, did the family react badly to this idea of the true love? And I think the true love is not just Vali. I think it's for everything before Anschluss. I think it was for this world that ceased to exist. I think it was for the Vienna that never was again, for all these people who were never again in the same room. That box of letters is not only her. It's his friends, it's a half-brother, it's nieces and nephews, and nephews. And it's an entire community that disintegrated. And these people were never again in the same room. Even if some of them survived, and even if you maintain friendships with a good handful of them, for him, I think the true love was a love for this lost world. And she became a symbol of that to some degree. That said, I don't think I would have written it if my grandmother was still living.
Well, unless there are any more questions, I guess we'll wrap it up. And Sarah will be signing books outside. I highly, highly recommend this one. It's beautifully, beautifully done. Thank you so much for being with us.